Today we're going to be discussing about AGOA, the American Growth and Opportunity Act. We're going to talk about the ramifications of its recent suspension and what it means for the African economy. We'll try to explore about how this will impact exporters, including but not limited to textile and other key affected sectors. To just give you a brief overview of what the AGOA means to the African economy in the recent years, it has been very encouraging in terms of finding new markets for African export items. And now, following the suspension of AGOA, many African countries will lose duty-free access to US markets, and its main effect will be on textile, apparel industries, and it will also affect small exporters as a whole. And it's part of Donald Trump's administration's pivot into trade from aid, but apparently this was supposed to be one of the mechanisms through which trade was supposed to be stimulated by providing easy access to entry for African goods. And I think AGOA, if we take South Africa, it has been instrumental for its auto as well as agricultural exports. And it also had a certain diplomatic element to it that strengthened South Africa's and America's relationship. I think everyone was anticipating for the AGOA to be renewed or maybe perhaps be extended given its looming deadline, but the Trump administration seems to have decided that it wasn't worth renewing. So I think I'm going to start with Arisa, and I'm going to ask you for your analysis of whether the decision made by the incumbent administration hurt Africa's exports in the short and long term, or will it just be a sign that countries need to diversify their markets and that they need to keep their options open?
Yeah.
To you, Arisa.
All right. Thank you, bro, for that brilliant introduction and, introducing this very relevant topic to us today, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGOA, that the Trump administration has recently decided to suspend. And I mean, it has various dimensions if we want to look at it and discuss it. But I would like to start by saying that I will start it from a particular context, especially from the context of Uganda, because I think when we look at AGOA, Uganda was suspended long time before. I think it was suspended on January 2024. But I mean, before that, you have explained it very well that it was an initiative which the US government introduced to ensure that maybe some African countries, especially from sub-Saharan Africa, can have access to the American market to boost trade, economic growth, and investment. But I mean, there is a preliminary argument which I would like to put forward that from an economic point of view, I think Abdul is an economist, will agree or disagree with me later when he's giving his analysis. I believe that there is no any development in that has ever happened between a developing country and a developed country. So in this way, based on the history of how countries developed, I would argue that the development between the trade between developing countries and developed countries, despite its necessity, it does less in terms of ensuring development in another country. So looking at this initiative, primarily the argument has been that it was aimed at stimulating trade, economic growth, and investment. But I mean, look at all of these aspects. Developed countries, in most cases, I would argue that they just use these initiatives to ensure that they have access, which is the other way around of having access to investment, having access to capital, having access to resources that their nations need from this other side. Because, as I said, I'll speak more in the context of Uganda, because Uganda was suspended in 2024 and it was part of this AGOA. Presumably, USA argued that they suspended Uganda because of the increased human rights violation. So that one also in itself is a red flag when you look at the initiative. If you argue that the initiative is about economic growth and development, then why do you have to link it with human rights, governance issues? Because I mean, if you are interested in the development of the country, some of these things shouldn't be brought in play, but it is an implication that the initiative also has political powers, which we cannot deassociate it with it. And also other things. I think also the landmark thing was about Uganda coming up with the Anti-Homosexuality Act, which was passed in 2003. And so United States and other supporters of some homosexuality, they were not happy. So they still used the same initiative to suspend Uganda, even before the Trump administration, decided to oppose all of these initiatives. So basically, I would say when you look at it at the face value, you see the economic value and impact. So basically argued from the point of these people who are bringing the initiative. But I mean, how much imports, how much exports are these countries in sub-Saharan Africa, were they taking to the American market? How much? Maybe Abdul has the figures. As an economist, he will come with those figures later in the discussion. But to me, I don't really see any large impact that the initiative was making for Uganda. As we speak today, there has been a diversification of the global economy. So America, whether they have suspended the initiative, there will be already other actors and players who are ready to come in and, for instance, take up the opportunity of having these imports from these countries. For instance, if you talk about coffee that is coming from Uganda and other exports. So in that regard, we may say that, yes, there might be an impact in the short run, because, I mean, if you look at the interconnectedness of this global market and the global economy, if something happens, for instance, the suspension of that initiative, which was basically had incorporated all of these countries into that chain, if it is terminated or stopped at a certain point, you expect some shocks in the short run, but later the economy tends to pick up and finds an alternative, for instance, from China and other upcoming markets, not necessarily the USA. So as I conclude, I would also like to look at it in terms of the Pan-African point of view. The suspension of the initiative, as I said, it opens up an opportunity for other actors. For instance, now it is the time for, say, the African Union to rethink something for the region, other than letting these countries, especially from within sub-Saharan Africa, continue relying on these foreign markets, which are, just as I've just said, that when you look at it critically, there are other implications, political implications, that someone wants to open market for you, but he wants you to accept homosexuality in your country. Someone wants you to export coffee or cotton or cocoa to their country, but on conditionalities. So this is the period where now the African institutions have to come in, or African organizations. So, for instance, I'm talking about the African Union to come in and suggest something other than looking at this global market. Of course, we need it. We can't say that we are going to isolate 100%. We need them. But other than relying to those markets and then compromising our own values, our own customs, our own cultures, we may start to rethink and also look at maybe China, because China doesn't come with these conditionalities. But of course, also focusing more on our internal trade within the Africa itself, because there is an unexploited market. So we just need to ensure that we also expand on that. But of course, not keeping, you know, uh, crying and blaming ourselves that, oh, they have suspended us from AGOA, or AGOA initiative has been closed. Now what are we going to do? It's a wake-up call to our countries within the region to start building our economies, to start being resilient against these shocks, and ensure that we invest in value addition to our commodities, other than, relying on these foreign markets. We should be in position to anticipate such scenarios, considering the fact that these countries, they actually use these initiatives not necessarily to make our countries develop, but to meet their own goals, as I have been saying from the beginning. So I will leave it at this point and let you guys also come in and weigh in. Thank you, Brooke.
Thank you, comrade. Thank you for the analysis. And I think before we go to Abdul Bari, to give you a bit of numbers, I think in 2023 it was close to $9.23 billion of exports that were exported through AGOA to the US. And I think rightly so, as Risa mentioned, it has been used in somewhat a carrot and stick manner to make sure certain political interests were put on African countries, Uganda being case in point. But also, I think we have also seen in Ethiopia as well, where when the civil war broke out, in response to certain human rights violations, the US administration suspended the AGOA export rights. That being said, there is no denying it. It has been used for political purposes. But more importantly, when the whole continent is exporting close to $9.6 billion, that's a significant amount of jobs behind it. That's a significant amount of industries, namely, I've already mentioned textile, but also we've seen agro industries, and some of the household brands, the American brands, have already left the market. If you take PVH, a very renowned style manufacturer, they produce Calvin Klein, they produce also Tommy Hilfiger brand, and to just give you an example, immediately after the suspension of AGOA in Ethiopia, which was in 2021, they exited more than 20 of their industrial sheds. And Abdul Bari, I want you to give me an economic analysis of what the suspension of AGOA means for Africa, for this budding industries, whether it's textile, whether it's in the agro processing sector. What will be the spillover effects of such action?
Yes, I kind of think that I'll first of all start with the geopolitical aspects and then bring the economics in. If we check the whole instrument of AGOA, it's something that, if we check by design, is a geopolitical instrument. And then we just have a positive externality, which is the benefit that it comes with. they cannot say outrightly this is what it is, but in a way, and positioning it the way they've done it, there's going to be some positive side of it, which we will always look at and not the geopolitical aspects. You look at it this way: if they make countries so dependent on their markets, now it means that they can use that leverage to force you to do something they want you to do. So it's just a manipulative tool. It's all part of a hegemon way of controlling the world. Now, if just like what happened in Ethiopia, if they said that, if let's say almost half of Ethiopian exports are were to through the AGOA, and now they are saying that we are withdrawing Ethiopia, Ethiopia would do everything at their disposal to bring back AGOA because lives will be hurt. And in doing so, whatever the US is asking them not to do, they are going to comply. So in effect, it was, for me, I see it more as a geopolitical tool than of economics. The economics was just a positive externality, but it has been there since 2000, and people's lives and jobs have been crafted around it. You see that most people, we see recently when tariffs, Trump gave his tariffs, we've seen what happened in, is it Botswana or Lesotho? I think it's Lesotho. We see what has happened. People losing their jobs because almost all their jobs were planned around the textile industry to be exported to the US. So when the tariffs hit, they had most of them lose their jobs. So we cannot ignore the economic aspect. We've become so deep because if we check from 2000 till now, that has been 25 years. So lives, jobs, and economies have been planned around it. But I see that if in a year we have 9 billion exports, that's a lot. You, I'm tempted to say that it's not a lot because it's like the trade hasn't deepened enough. But 9 billion is, you can't say it's nothing, but it is in a way huge to make a difference. So what I see is that the economic benefits are enormous, and we've seen what happened in Lesotho, in Botswana. So suspending it will be catastrophic for us. But I think suspending it in the long run will help us because now textile producers in Botswana will have to look for buyers in other African countries, and that goes to help the continental African trade area. So the short run cost for us is going to be very difficult to undo, but in the long run, I think is going to benefit us a lot. So I think for now we can renegotiate it, and then just that everybody, so that we don't get a sudden hit. What is most stressing to people is sudden shocks, like all of the sudden you are there and then something happened to you, you didn't anticipate it. But now if you're able to renegotiate it to maybe to be extended for 5 years or whatever years, and now everybody start looking for alternative markets within Africa, markets that they are skilled, you don't need you are not subjected to geopolitics. In that case, you will be very safe from all these things. So my take will be that, okay, let's extend it this time, and then everybody takes time to look for alternative markets for your long run. And if we check the trade composition of whatever we've been sending to the US, it's just textiles and primary exports like oil and textiles. So to me, those things are not important. If we want to, because the US doing this, they know that the African economies cannot hit their economies because mostly what we do best is exporting primary goods. They know that very well. So I think that we can shift away from them because for primary products like oil or whatever, there's always demand for them. So I think my take would be for them to extend it for a few time, and then maybe we find alternative markets within Africa. That's my take on it.
Thank you, Abdul Bari. Could you unpack how African economies can be better off after being suspended out of AGOA. It seems that the suspension of AGOA would result in hundreds of thousands of jobs being lost. To just give you an example, the textile sector in Kenya, in Ethiopia, vanilla producers in Madagascar, all of those industries would lose market access. A lot of textile companies are reconsidering offshoring their production to Bangladesh, Vietnam, since those countries have a trade agreement with the US that is by far more favorable. So how do you see the AGOA suspension as an economic benefit in the long term?
I said this goes back to what the point I was trying to push through initially. The thing is that for now, in the short run, just like all what you mentioned, is like we've come to structure full economies around it. Like you look at the number of jobs that will be lost in Madagascar, in Ethiopia, Kenya, or Botswana, Lesotho. You look at those numbers and you realize that with time, over the 20-year period, the access has given us some sort of opportunity to trade with the US. And we've started, and I'm happy that people exploited it because it means that without that market, those people would not probably have those jobs. So it means that we can not just say only negative things about the AGOA. It means that in the 20-year period, it has actually created jobs for people in the textile industry. So now terminating that go up will mean that all these people, we don't have the figures now, but we know it's huge, are going to be unemployed. We already know how susceptible our economies are, high unemployment rate or whatever. So this one will only compound the situation. It means that the numbers we are already battling with, they are going to be more. But my point is that we should try as much as we can to extend it, and then know that we have to build measures such that in the near future, even if it's suspended, we can still have alternative ways. Because it is good that we get to trade with the US without any barriers. Let's put the geopolitical aspect aside. It is good to just send something to another country without duty. That's pretty good. So it makes sense that we extend it, even if we're able to get markets within ourselves. It's still an opportunity to explore because there are some things that are demanded in the US, which I think may not have markets in Africa. So you look at maybe I'm tempted to say that our incomes are not that high to sometimes purchase some of the most luxury brands of clothes. So if you are able to manufacture and there's no market for it in Africa, exporting such things to the US, it makes sense. And it builds on the point that we should extend AGOA for now. But on the other side, extending it and not looking for alternative measures will mean that we are still putting ourselves on the line in case we have an American shock. It will just be like anybody who sits in the US and say that he's going to disrupt our economies. He's able to do it because if he says that, okay, from today, AGOA is gone, thousands of jobs will be lost. And any government in Africa who doesn't comply, that's what they are going to do. And so you are just an African government will be more like a representation of the US government just to carry out what they want to say. Because if you don't, they're going to hold some certain things and your government will collapse. So I think that for the short run, we need the AGOA. But in the long run, we need to find alternative means within Africa or alternative market to strengthen our internal trade. Yeah, that's what I have to say on that.
Okay. Thank you, Alubari, for your analysis. Now I think I'm going back to Comrade, and what does this mean? Does this mean that African countries have now to consider the sectors they've invested in for the past decade or so, whether it's the textile industry, whether it's the agro-processing industry? Does it mean that those sectors have to be reconsidered, or does it mean we have to look to new markets, whether it's Europe, whether it's China, whether it's India? Where are we, and what do you see happening in the months and years to come? How do you see industrial policy taking shape? Risa.
Yeah, thank you, Brooke, for that question. I mean, and first of all, apologies. I think my internet is not good today, so that's why I decided to keep the camera off.
Please carry on.
Increase my connectivity. But I would really say that yes, just as any other country, as a country or in an economy, you can't be having one area of investment. Always countries make assessments to see which area they need to invest in, which sector needs to be invested in, where investments need to improve, and where, depending on the global trends. So assessments are done and changes are always done, you know. So the closing of, as we have been saying, it comes as, on one hand, as we have already discussed, is a blessing for African countries, especially those who were within the initiative, to rethink, as we have all agreed. We need to rethink, we need to take this as a wake-up call, because, you can't 100% base the whole country's economy on an initiative which you don't have control over, on an initiative that is a tool, not only as an economic tool, but a political tool for other nations to control and decide on what you can do and what you can't do. As Abdullah has already urged it very well, that he looks at it in one way as a geopolitical or a political tool, something that I agree with. As we have been saying, yes, we see a lot of countries that had entirely depended or based their economies on the initiative. So you have talked about Uganda, other countries, even Central African Republic, Gabon, Niger, and others. All of these countries, and basically those that I have mentioned, just like Uganda, they were suspended based on human rights and governance concerns. So, for me, as a person who is passionate about governance and political issues, this just beats my understanding. You can't bring an initiative arguing that this is an economic initiative that is purely intended to boost your economy, grow, and then out of blue, you start, looking into these other issues. And, based on that, you wake up one day and you say, regardless of which sector has been depending on the initiative, regardless of how many people have been employed in the sector, these guys don't look at those issues when it comes to this. So what should this mean to a layman person like me, who and in this case, I can take myself, okay, if I say I'm now a representative of the government, of a certain government that is part of the initiative, what does this mean? What does this mean to me? So it is something that, makes us to rethink, as we have been saying. We need to interact and engage with other economic actors in this global economy, not as powerless people, and of course not as powerful if we are speaking from an African context. But I like the way how China packages themselves, though I'm not saying that we should run to China. When China is engaging in international cooperation and trade with African countries, they always urge that we are mutual partners. We are collaborating mutually. So almost we take ourselves as, equals. Although, yes, we are not equals, but you can't wake up one day because of an initiative and decide to shut it down when a lot of people have been depending on it. So that is a red flag. that our countries need to, take serious. And as we have been saying, that we need to rethink our economic engagement. I mean, the whole basic point here, I think it is for our countries to really sit down on the drawing board and reconsider our trade. Because even if we would say, okay, now let's look at a deep analysis of the sectors that we are depending on AGOA, what were we exporting? You can speak about those figures, but figures, people don't eat figures. People don't eat the billions that we are mentioning here. Let's go back on the ground and we assess the impact. Yeah. Because at the end of the day, it is all about the impact. We may talk about the billions, but how many people's lives have been impacted by these billions? Barely one or two man in the economy. They hold the billions that we are talking about. Life still goes on. Life still goes on as usual in the local context. So I mean, at the end of the day, that's the kind of reassessment that our countries need. And back to your question, Brooke, our countries need to reassess, first of all, our sectors and identify the sectors that are really crucial to our people. And also, after identifying those sectors, then we need something that I also talked about before, value addition. We need to rethink what are we putting on the global market. Because even if we have these initiatives, but we are still exporting raw materials. For instance, Ghana, they produce cocoa. But if we have this initiative, and for example, if Ghana is part of it, and still they are putting cocoa on the market as cocoa as it is without any value addition, at the end of the day, is going to benefit. It is the processing company in these developed countries that makes the final products out of cocoa. Because how much raw cocoa costs on the market vis-a-vis the products of cocoa, for instance, chocolate, the price is different. I mean, we consume chocolate and these other cocoa products, but the person who gains from that product is not the local farmer here in Ghana who produces it. No. So it goes back to what I said before, that the initiative is there just as a blindfold to us that we are part of the initiative. But as long as we are still putting raw materials on the market or within that initiative, at the end of the day, the person who is going to benefit is not a local person here, is not our community here. We shall get the peanuts out of the whole, cake that we would be sharing as an Africa. So our economists and the politicians need to rethink, come up with initiatives, rethink our, investment modalities, identify key sectors, and also start to, attracting these investments locally. It will be a painful process, as we have been saying. In the beginning, a lot of people, a lot of companies getting affected, maybe even shrinking of the economy, but in the long run, if we also say, okay, now if it is time for America first, now let it be Africa first. Let it be our economies first. Why should you always run to explore these other markets which are already built and constructed for their own benefit rather than concentrating on building our own resilience? So that would be my argument at this point. Over to you, Brooke.
Thank you, comrade, for your analysis. Before I pass it on to Abdul Bari, I want to say a few things. Well, the fact that AGOA has been suspended doesn't mean that Africa will not be trading with the US. But the AGOA did give Africa, non-reciprocal trade access, meaning that African countries could export duty-free without offering the same privilege back to the US. So if you ask what has changed now, it will be the fact that following the suspension, there is a new clear signal, and that is that it's not going to be a one-way trade model. The US also wants to sell its exports to Africa, and it wants to make sure that it's getting a fair share of the deal. So what does that mean? African countries will have to compete not only in terms of quality, but in terms of quantity, in terms of logistics, you name it. So we're seeing a shift from a preferential trade access, which, to be honest, has created a type of dependency on AGOA. And now we're moving towards a more competitive market where African exporters, African countries are expected to improve their manufacturing standards, where they're expected to invest in logistics, certification, and value addition. I mean, that being said, the US isn't the only market in the world as well. I think starting next year, and I think it has already started between a few countries, the African Continental Free Trade Area is also kicking in. And I think there is a huge potential there as well if somehow we can shift the focus from the AGOA, which is outward, to inward intra-African trade. And I think if we are to build regional value chains, there is no reason why a cotton grown in Benin can be spun in Kenya, it can be stitched in Uganda, and it can be sold across the continent. I mean, we can expect South Africa to export its manufactured pharmaceutical products, its cars to African countries who now mostly buy from Europe and much more recently from India and China. So I think there's a huge synergy at play to compensate for AGOA. And if played correctly, the African Continental Free Trade Area could perhaps, in a way, offset AGOA and retain jobs. But if you're looking at existing numbers, I mean, if you look at Europe, out of the total trade that happens in Europe, the continental trade accounts nearly 3/4 of the trade that happens there. So you have to really appreciate how Europe is well integrated. But when you look at Africa as it stands, it's not even 1/4. We're looking at 10 to 15% of trade that is happening within Africa. So it leaves a lot to be desired in that regards. And I think as AGOA is suspended, there is also the potential that AGOA 2.0 is on the horizon, but I wouldn't be too confident, especially under this administration. But I think you've got the initiatives within the European Union, whether it's the economic partnership agreements, everything but arms agreements with the European Union. I mean, China also has been rolling out a lot of attractive trade treaties for African countries to consider. So I think it's due time that Africa realizes that it's no longer a passive trade player, and that Africa is becoming a multi-aligned market that's able to negotiate leverage between competing powers. And I mean, that being said, however, I cannot stress enough the importance of, the relevance of how AGOA is suspended for, a renewed approach in our industrial policy. I mean, as Comrade earlier mentioned, if we're looking at what we're exporting, raw cocoa beans, we're exporting crude oil, we're exporting cotton. And what are we getting back, For every cocoa we were sending, we're importing, very expensive chocolate. For every crude oil we're sending, we're getting, expensive, refined petrol. For every cotton we're sending, we're getting refined garment. So I think this could spark a very interesting industrial policy renaissance. Of course, it requires investment infrastructure to be able to process the goods that were, in the past targeted to be exported in raw to something more processed to be able to trade among us African countries. But, I don't feel confident at this time in our policymakers and in their ability to take this event, take this suspension as an opportunity to advance industrial policy, to reskill, to pivot to new opportunities and to new markets. And Abdul Bari, do you think our policymakers are up to this task? Do you think they can rise up to the challenge? Because, to be honest, I don't.
Yeah, I think you kind of know me to be this government skeptic. I don't trust our policies makers a lot in several areas, and something as crucial as this, which is sometimes troubling for countries that say they have structured way of doing things. It troubles them. So you can imagine the harm or the trouble it will give to developing countries or the kind of leaders we have in our countries. I think what we have in our countries is politics and nothing more. Everybody is just thinking about how he gets in and how he gets out, and there's no actually a long-term plan as to how we're going to move forward as people. So I think the African Union has been instrumental in this way because they know that if we leave ourselves away as countries, everybody is going to advance uh, 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 um, his individual interests, and we are not going to go far as a continent. And that is why we have the African Free Trade Area. Something like that will make us know that, okay, now we have this. The US doesn't want us to trade with them anymore. Not that, just like you said, not that we shouldn't trade anymore with them, but now we are going to be treated like anybody else. Then it begs the question that where should we go? And that is where the AFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, comes in, which has been championed by the African Union. So I think that the African Union is doing a tremendous effort in bringing our countries together. Although most of the times we see that their effort is not enough, I think that when some of these things comes, you see that okay, though we've not made progress, but by setting the stage, it kind of gives you a perspective of how each government should approach it. And I think African governments, though we don't have policies, but we are seeing the long run solution. I was listening to a politician who is a presidential candidate in Cote d'Ivoire, and he said something I was really happy about. In all his campaign promises, although he's promising something for the Ivorian people, one thing he keeps saying is that we need to look inward. We need to do everything with our brothers. And all his visions that he was talking about, he tend to connect them with the broader African views. I was so happy that these are the kind of politicians we want. We have minute countries. We have countries that are so small that it is very difficult for you to survive as a country. So you need the broader continent to work well. But the question as to whether our policymakers are taking steps towards this, okay, you cannot just say that they are not doing anything. At least they've ratified the African Continental Free Trade Area. That is one step ahead. But that is just like setting fire and not putting the pot on to cook. It's just a fire. So now we have to see how we can remove the hurdles. We have to see how for every small thing that we are producing, instead of trying to find markets in Asia, in Europe, or in the Americas, we should look for a market inwards. African government, like I kind of think that governments in Africa would need a way that, okay, if you're an exporter, you are exporting to another African country, what the government would do for you as a producer in my company is that there will be tax waivers for you if your exports are to another African country. That way is some sort of motivation for people to trade with other African countries. But if we just leave them and said, okay, there's African Continental Free Trade Area, you can trade with anybody else, what you're going to see is that we know the trading problems with Africa, like transport, with high cost of freight and whatever. So the person will prefer rather sending it to the US, where he's going to get big money with less cost to whatever he's transporting there, than trying to move it from, say, Nigeria to Tanzania or whatever. So I think now the ball is on our policy makers' court to design the best of policies to help people integrate. And I think this one, maybe it will just be another mirage. I hope it's not. I really hope that it's not. And if we're able to
Allow
achieve
me
this,
allow me to quickly pick your brains, and if you were put in a position of a policymaker, what would be your go-to decision if you suddenly heard in the morning that the US had decided not to renew AGOA? As a policymaker, what are the sectors you'd be interested in doubling down on? What type of measures are you looking to take?
Yes, I think this is like saying move away from the questioning and the criticism to offering solutions. Exactly. And
Yes,
just like I
indeed.
was saying initially, I will my first solution will be that okay, it's a shock. And we see what governments have done during the COVID. We know that this we don't have an immediate solution to it. So what you're going to do is that such businesses, you have to give them some sort of incentives to make sure that they are sustained for the short run. Because if you let go, you are putting families and lives at risk. So me as a government, the short-term solution will be that okay, if you are in these industries, I'll ask wherever the industry is, find an alternative market within Africa. It may sound like, okay, finding an alternative market is not a short-term solution, but as it says the base way, and if you're able to find a market and you're exporting to it, I'm going to make sure that, okay, if we're paying 15% for VAT, now you're going to pay only 10%. If you're paying this, going to just make sure that there are a lot of things to incentivize you to search quickly for alternative markets within Africa. So maybe other policies could be like giving them preferential treatment at the ports, making sure that the some administrative process are shorten for them, the bureaucratic process they have to go through are shortened for them so that in the shortest possible time they can find alternative ways of doing it. That would be my best shot for now.
Okay, great. Teresa, I'm going to ask you the same question. If you are in a position to make certain decisions, what would be your response to AGOA suspension? I think we may have lost
Yes,
Teresa.
Brooke,
Okay, yes.
I'm there. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Loud and clear. Yeah, I mean, yes, as an alternative, I think one of them, the strong one, has been already discussed by Abdul. That is one of the immediate alternative that we should think about as Africa, because I mean, look at the African population, the African Continental Free Trade Area. Africa projections indicated that in the next 5 to 15 years is going to be having almost close to 2 billion population in terms of population, because I think now is 1 point something. So that population comes with a huge market, though it is currently not exploited, because I think, yeah, as I said, today it is around 1.4.5 billion people, but in the next coming years, that population is going to double. So why should we still continue to go and knock and beg on other people's door when we know that there is uncertainty, as we have already indicated before? So I mean, instead of looking at the short term profits, as Abdul said, like, maybe most of our companies and most of our countries, they look at the prices that are being offered to us and all of these duty-free exportation that we are being offered by the US, substituting our own initiative to grow our own market and also maybe exploit the African market. But if something like that happens, if at all I was in the position of power and policy, it would be the time to start really strengthening our own institutions to ensure that such a things never happen in the future. After would be one of the solution, but also as someone who is interested in partnership area, I would say, as I said before, that it is time to diversify our allies and partners. in this case, because I really still say that I'm shocked by the fact that all of these so-called economic and sometimes social programs are used as political tools to, impose conditionalities and influence how things should happen in our own society. People don't care about the diversity, people don't care about the uniqueness of societies. What they care about is their own interest. If you don't accept homosexuality, we shall close the initiative. If you don't accept to govern in a certain way, for instance, democratically, then we shall kick you out of the initiative. So it is high time that we diversify and rethink our partnerships. For instance, we have talked about the China, we have talked about other allies which are really not that more, strong and, rigid in terms of these other aspects. But I mean, I think it is also high time to, start supporting effectively, especially by our countries to support the BRICS. We haven't talked about the BRICS. The BRICS, I think Brazil, Russia, India, China still, and South Africa. This is a rising giant, especially in terms of South-South cooperation. Countries, which especially developing countries and also most of African countries inclusive, it is time for them to, realize the greatness. I think also Abdul was talking about the market value that we are having within our own countries. Also, Brooke, you mentioned about it. We need to re-strategize, and instead of, continuing to contribute to the growth of markets which are already established, reinvest all the efforts within our markets, especially within the BRICS. Of course, the US will not be happy with that. We have seen it already fighting the BRICS, fighting all of the proposals that are moving around being proposed by the BRICS. But I mean, this is the way to go, also to show that, okay, well, you may suspend the initiative, but we have alternatives. So that way, maybe it will sound an alarm to those in charge of such initiatives to also rethink their decisions before they do it, before they go ahead with implementing them. Because now, as we have been saying, they have suspended all of those countries, as I was saying before, and the whole AGOA initiative expired on 30th, I think 30th September last month, and there haven't been any renewal or any discussion on what is going to happen, and I think this is why we are discussing it. So it is very alarming, as we said, but also it is very clear, just as Brooke you mentioned, that yes, it doesn't mean that these countries will not trade with the US, but that special treatment is gone, and it is gone with the other implications, as we have seen all of the, those other conditionalities that have been put on the countries. So on top of those other things, I have also in this episode talked much more about the need to invest in the value addition on our commodities. Brooke, you have also mentioned this. We need to move beyond raw materials. We have been exporting raw materials since colonial times. But when I read African history, especially before colonialism, we were producing products on the continent. So we should ask ourselves what happened. All those in charge of the country should go back to the history. I mean, both of us, we have been in the class where professors have referred us to go back and read. Things were happening before, especially that colonial shock happened. But now, what happened before? Because until now, I mean, it is very shocking. We have discussed this throughout, how we are exporting, for instance, coffee, raw coffee from Uganda on the global market. But when you go in the supermarket to buy Nescafe, to buy this cappuccino, to buy all of these other products, Ethiopia, you are the best in making coffee in Africa. But I mean, how much value does the local farmer in Ethiopia get from this coffee? Nothing, because he's selling the raw coffee. The person who is gaining from the coffee is the processing plant in Europe, is the processing plant in America. So we need to rethink the value addition chain. Now we have the potential to increase our productivity capacity. So the moment we rethink all of this and start to say, okay, now we need to start processing these goods here, I mean, it is just a matter of restructuring, as we said. We need to rethink where do we need to invest and how should we invest there. It will not be easy in the beginning because it requires capital, but we have to sacrifice. As I mentioned, I think in the previous episode, that always when a country is developing or progressing, there is a period for suffering. This one we may agree or disagree, but that period is always there. The period of sacrificing in terms of capital, in terms of people, going beyond self-interest to national interests. But without that, then we shall still suffer. I think also we need to re-strategize with our regional blocks, because there are a lot of blocks. Here in West Africa, there are blocks. I think we have ECOWAS. Abdul knows much more about that. He can talk about that. We have ECOWAS in the West. We have the East African Community and in East Africa. We have SADC there. So there are blocks. So those blocks internally to start boosting intra-trade within African region, as we also consolidate the AFTA, which we talked about, and a lot of other policy recommendation which we can have. So, but for the interest of time, it is really a wake-up call, not only this initiative, but of course, since we are being given that so-called special treatment, for me I put it in quotes, because despite the scaring figures that we can mention, I really see less that has trickled down to our people. So yeah, our policymakers and the government officials in positions of power, they need to understand these issues very well and start to think long term, not short term. And also, by the fact that the initiative has been used as a political tool, then we need to also understand that anytime such a thing can happen and it really has negative impacts to our population. So we need to build institutions that are going to serve the community, not the foreign interests. So back to you, Brooke.
Okay. Thank you, comrade. I think you've put it appropriately in what it takes to be able to capture the opportunity that is in front of us. But, the AGOA side, I think the African Continental Free Trade Area has been a project in the making for the past 5 years or more. And I think it's getting into the phase of execution. Of course, I know there is a laundry list of problems that if you ask someone, that they will tell you why Africa hasn't been able to conduct trade between its fellow countries. But in terms of identifying the low-hanging fruits, I'm going to put this on you, Abdul Bari, if you'll bear with me. Where do you think are the most effective interventions needed in terms of unlocking intra-country trade with regard to the African Continental Free Trade Area? Do you see it in terms of logistic infrastructure? Do you see it in terms of policies and regulations that seem to be very prohibitive to look inwards? Do you think it's a soft infrastructure? Do you think it's a hard infrastructure? Where do you see specifically changes are needed highly?
I think it's a complicated problem, because you look at it and see that it's a multi-dimensional issue, and both things need to go together to ignite the trade within Africa. In as much as we need policies for to lure our businesses to trade among others, we still need to make sure that the ability to do that is less costly to other options. So that is where the logistics comes in. Most of the times when I look at this thing in my own perspective, I tend to see that for now we are logistically constrained, and that is the biggest problem, because if it's just impossible for a business in Ghana who is trying to export something to Ethiopia or to somewhere in Tanzania, if you are using flight, look at how much a flight costs. If you want to use the freight, look at the cost of it. So I, for now, see that the logistic constraint is our biggest problem. Even if you check the road network, I live in a border community, and then you look at the road network between two countries, and that should have been the major trading route between those countries. And that road is just nothing to write home about. The condition of the road is more like somebody's a path for some rodents or whatever. A big car traveling through that is going to have problems. So if you're a business who want to say trade with Burkina Faso, you're just going to look at the cost of transporting everything to Burkina Faso, which is just a near neighbor. There's not even road for it. You can imagine. So although I say that we need a multi-dimensional attack to the issue, we need both policy, we need logistics, we need to make sure that everything is in place. But for now, I much think that the logistics is a big problem. But somebody may also argue that sometimes when you put the policies in place to make sure that businesses see the opportunity somewhere else, people are innovative. Even without government, people are going to come up with solutions to make sure that these logistics through private individuals or those private individuals can force government to implement those solutions they've identified. So it's very difficult to isolate where should we target first, which one should come second. I think they kind of have to move together. Like I said earlier, for now the logistics is a big problem, but putting the policies in place will make businesses see the opportunities, and they will be forced to invent solutions to solve those problems. And inventing solutions just means that overcoming these other problems. So I would say that it needs to be a unified push. We have to, it's possible to do both together. It's not like they are mutually exclusive. We can actually do them together. So I think for my own opinion, I would say that governments must tackle these ones together to make sure that intra-African trade is pushed. Back to you, Brooke.
Thank you for your response, Abdul Bari. And Erisa, do you have anything to add with regards to where a prioritized intervention is in demand?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting, especially in the context of considering the local African market that we are talking about. Of course, the aspect of infrastructure is very important in terms of trading between countries, but also legislation and regulations are also important, I think. And of course, we need to develop our own funds locally to reduce reliance on external funds, which is something that we have been talking about throughout the whole discussion, building our own resilience. But in terms of, making trade easier, we need to prioritize infrastructure, both in terms of roads, in terms of ports for those countries which have access to the different seas and oceans that surround the continent, and in terms of systems, because I think these days digitalization has become a very central issue. Innovation and digitalization, it is not yet developed in the African context, but we need it in terms of trade. So I would say that is also one of the priority areas that we can invest in terms of boosting the infrastructure for trading. But also, as we have been saying, we need to strengthen the connection, bilateral trade within our countries, like without even looking further, first of all from within the continent, but also expanding to the emerging markets, especially in India, China, and those countries within the BRICS, as I said before. So those would be the priority areas that I would think about at the moment, in terms of ensuring that we reduce dependency, because as a development practitioner, as a development person, I have never seen any country that has developed through dependency on external markets. Never. That's why when Trump came in and America was crumbling, he's trying to close up everything. That is the theory that most, economists don't want to preach to developing countries, rather than they just tell developing countries to open up the market, allow foreign investment. No countries has ever developed that way. Countries develop through protectionism. They develop by closing up their markets. And when their domestic markets have grown and strong enough to withstand competition from outside, then you can talk about opening up. You can talk about all of these global initiatives that you want other countries to come in. But before that, Africa is being lured into these so-called global markets and initiatives at the expense of its own economies, as you have, stressed it throughout the whole discussion. So I'm not arguing that we need to close up from the global market and economy. We need to engage, but with caution, but also with priority to our local economies and priority to our local sectors, just as we see from these developed countries. I mean, at this point, they are crumbling. And that's why they are closing up everything, because their economies can't compete globally. But poor African economies, they are opening up and crying over these closed initiatives. I mean, they are nice, but not at a particular point where you can't compete with the rest of the world. So it is an opportunity for me, for Africa to build. It will not be an easy route or an easy way, as we have talked about all of these other things that are necessary for us to, boost the trade. So if our countries can identify those areas, invest the resources there, slowly by slowly we can get there. So, thank you, bro.
Yeah, let me just add something to what Erisa says. I think Erisa, in my opinion, has been very critical of some fundamental things, but in this regard, I tend to agree with him more closely in the fact what he said, that trade can sometimes like that countries don't develop through trade. It's a huge thing to say, and you will realize that in economics, some people actually agree with what Erisa is saying, because for long the argument has always been that trade caused development, and even between 90s 30s you see that most works in economics that try to see whether trade helps people to develop, they've been able to find that okay, wherever people open up their borders, there's going to be development. But that is just a correlation we see. But you can't link that to something more like a causation. You can't say that they are unable to say that it's a trade that caused the development. But you look at as a student of economics, some one thing I actually like much is the structuralist view. Those people, they are from developing countries and they diagnose the developing countries issues, and then they give you a perspective that was hidden if we're reading or you are learning from those from the developed part. They actually say, and their way is pretty simple. They kind of say that if you look at a country which is underdeveloped, I think Erisa said this earlier, that what we do is basically to export cocoa seeds, to export coffee. And what do we import? An expensive chocolate. What do we import? An expensive processed coffee. So it's like we'll be locking in a sequence of our underdevelopment. You export cheap and then you import expensive. Export cheap, import expensive. So it means that you keep losing something out, and that you are going to be locking in this some sort of underdevelopment. There's no way you can make it out. And I think that the relationship between trade and development is quite complicated, because one can also argue that, you see, trade, sometimes we tend to receive goods that without trade we wouldn't be exposed to, and they kind in a way improves our lives. So it's something nuanced to say, and I think that we have to do what we can. What we cannot cancel trade. What we have to do is just make sure that we don't export what the F give us. We must process them into something valuable before exporting. Yeah, back to you, Luke.
Thank you, Abdul Bari, for adding a few words. And I also want to add a few words before we close this episode in AGOA. And I think you're right in a way that no country has rapidly developed through only trade. But I think if there's any indication, the fact that China, Korea, Japan, Taiwan have managed to grow rapidly in the last half century, I think that has created certain negative spillover effects for Africa, because as we increasingly see, the Western world, whether it's the US or whether it's the European Union, are now becoming more protectionist. So they're looking at China, Korea, Taiwan, and the growth that they've been able to achieve as a mistake on their side. Because I think the US Vice President J.D. Vance, funny enough, said in a speech that, we wanted them to work, on the bottom of the value chain, but somehow the Chinese have slowly climbed the top of the value chain. And I mean, he even referred to the Chinese as peasants at some point. And I'm not quite surprised that AGOA was suspended, because I think the US specifically and the Western world at large has been soul searching these past few decades. And I think they've come into this anonymous decision that they're not really keen on sharing technology. They're not really keen on trading with the aim of advancing and helping countries to prosper. And I think AGOA is, a very appropriate wake-up call to African leaders that the type of technological exchange, the type of technological transfer that countries were anticipating through such bilateral trade mechanisms are somewhat a pipe dream. And if past performance is of any indication of what's to come, and I think most certainly that, Africa has to dig deep and try to find ways to reskill, to reindustrialize its industries in a way that's more conducive to the 21st century, to the knowledge economy. And yeah, that's what I have to add. If you guys don't have anything to add, I think this will be it for this week's installment. And I think we've had very interesting, very in-depth discussion about AGOA and its unfortunate but fortuitous suspension. So until next week.
All right, until next week. See you in Nairobi.
See you in Nairobi. Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.